And just say again, good morning and welcome to everybody. I know there's a lot of things happening around town today and this weekend, but we appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning for what we think will be a very educational program. Just a few things I want to catch you up on before we get started. We had a wonderful Peace, Love, Vote fundraiser. We've talked about it a little bit this morning. So I want to thank the group that was led by Ann Calvert and Rita Golden, Cindy Cart, and those that helped find donors for raffle prizes, which I had Laura Marcus Mountjoy and Reva's with us today, and again, Cindy Cart. And in case you haven't heard, we have hired Bree Bullock as our first office manager and paid employee. And Bree is currently working 20 hours a week and is being trained by Rita on a variety of projects. And those of you that were at Peace, Love, Vote got to meet Bree. And in fact, her table won the trivia contest, which is, hey, that was great. The league is backing the People Not Politicians referendum petition to allow the voters to decide whether they accept the new maps approved by the legislature during this special session. Many of our members are collecting signatures and notarizing signatures that need to be turned in by early December, and the final cutoff date is December 11th. So if you're out and about and you have not signed and want to sign, make sure you go up and ask them what petition it is. There are several petitions going out, and you need to keep track of which ones you're signing, because we've had that with a number of people coming up. Well, I don't know if I signed that one or if I signed the other one. So try to keep track with what you're signing. There are a lot of volunteer opportunities for voter registration events listed on the website. Many of those require DEI training. We're also participating in the No Kings 2.0 rally at Mill Creek Park, and other members are going to be at other locations. And I want to remind you that you can wear your league shirts and buttons as long as you don't carry a partisan sign. Just be careful with your signage. Take pictures of yourselves at these events. And if you want a League of Women Voters t-shirt, let me know. I brought some of them home from storage. We're just giving them out. If you want a t-shirt, either get in touch with me or put it in the chat and somebody could let me know. We want to tell people that we're out there and that we care about our community. With so many events going on, there is a need to make more buttons and get voter registration cards marked. And if you're inclined to help, there's a work party on Tuesday, October 14th. There's a volunteer that's listed on the volunteer opportunity chart, and that's going to be at Becky Yaki's house. Thanks to those that have taken the time to complete the survey regarding meetings and social events. There's still time to complete it. It was emailed to you several weeks ago, but it was also in this latest e-voter. And the board will be looking at that information to know what we want to do with meetings moving forward. So if you haven't answered that, please take the time to do that. And finally, Judy Ann, Vice President of Communications, and I put together a little quick guide to the League of Women Voters Kansas City. And we're going to have this as a handout at the No Kings 2.0 events and hopefully other events down the road too. But I thought, just to get us in the right frame of mind, it's entitled 7 Things You Need to Know About the League of Women Voters Kansas City. 1, our mission: to empower voters and protect democracy. 2, we are nonprofit, nonpartisan, and grassroots. 3, we learn the concerns of our communities, study issues, and seek solutions. 4, we advocate, educate, and litigate to protect every American's freedom to vote. 5, nonpartisan promise: we do not support or oppose candidates or political parties. 6, why? We believe that the freedom to vote is a nonpartisan issue. And 7, we are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in principle and in practice. Just good reasons to know why we matter in today's time. And again, those are going to be available to hand out. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward. Our guest speaker today is going to be talking to us about a very hot topic in the news. She will educate us on the different immigration pathways and today's immigration climate. She welcomes questions even during her presentation. Probably if you hear her talking about something, if you have a question, put it in the chat room, and our meeting tech people will make sure that that gets shared. Our guest speaker today is Joan Kelly. She is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Jewish Vocational Services and previously oversaw their refugee settlement, employment, and support services. She has more than a decade of experience working with refugees, immigrants, and displaced populations domestically and abroad, including long-term work in Syria, Haiti, and Tanzania. Having worked in refugee camps overseas, Joan is passionate about community building. She worked with the International Rescue Committee as a US Resettlement Program Officer, setting policy and guidance to ensure successful refugee integration across more than 30 US cities. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Joan worked with state governments to design testing and vaccine programs to reach the most vulnerable populations, including refugee and immigrant groups. She is originally from Toronto, Canada, but is happy to call Kansas City, Missouri home with her husband and 2 sons. Joan, we want to thank you for being here today and sharing your information with us. So,
thank you so much for having me. And when Melanie asked me to speak and asked me kind of what we would talk about, I really wanted to underscore that this time is your time. And I'm hopeful to really get into the nuances and the weeds of things, if that's what you want. And we can stay big picture too. But I really, really encourage you to ask questions. I do have a presentation, but I don't want that to hinder you from reaching out and asking questions as we go along if something's really burning, or it just pops up and you don't want to forget. Please just feel free to unmute and ask a question or put it in the chat or whatever is best for you. I'm going to share the presentation now, and I can make this available to you as well afterwards, if that would be helpful.
yes.
And then I received all the questions that people submitted when they were registering, and so I'm fairly confident I've got all of them kind of incorporated. But if I do not get to your question, and you want to stick around afterwards or anything, this is really, I think, the most important part of my work right now. And so happy to help in any way. And so as mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about refugee and immigrant affairs and kind of the big picture, and then zoom it into our community. But just as a background, JVS was founded 76 years ago in response to the Holocaust and as a refugee resettlement agency welcoming largely the Jewish population fleeing the Holocaust and other populations. Obviously, populations have changed over the years, but the mission really stays the same, in that we are dedicated to engaging, encouraging, and empower immigrants and refugees to achieve successful social, cultural, and economic integration. And I think our mission and our vision is really alive today, that we really see that our communities thrive when they're strengthened by diversity. And we firmly believe that everyone has intrinsic worth and dignity, and that really anyone can flourish with appropriate support. And so that's kind of the grounding of, I think, this conversation. I like to admit my bias, that I am bought into this, these things align with my values. And so I will fully admit that my answers to some questions are grounded in kind of this belief. This is a lot of words from an article that I read, I think it came out a couple of years ago, about why migrants, and it was actually written about the European kind of context of things, but like, why is immigration and migrant ideas, and why is this always in the news? Why is this? I met with the director of housing at in Kansas City, Missouri about a year ago, and he goes, "Nice to meet you. I've got the most political job in City Hall." And I said, "Nice to meet you. I bet I've got the most political job in Kansas City." So, but why is that? And I like to know the why behind things. And I think that this is a really clear explanation that the reason why migration is so often a hot topic, and a reason why we can use it for better or for worse as a tool, is because it is so intrinsically linked with who we are and our values. It can be really symbolic. So we talk about the various different religions of population groups that migrate around the world. It speaks to our identity, my my family and what I look like versus what other people look like, and it speaks to our core of who we are, and it touches on things that are really sensitive, right? Like my safety and security, but also my economic security and my jobs. These things are all interwoven. There's very few times I hear anything about immigration policy without there being an economic lens to it. And so it's really one of those areas that we can either speak to our basis of humanity, or we can really speak to exploitation, right? Most people talk about immigration, and maybe not a lot of folks have a deep relationship with an immigrant or a refugee. Oftentimes we talk about it as a monolith, like all of these people, and we don't talk about individuals. And so that often gives this group less power and less voice. This is all just a long way of saying it's not a surprise and it's not circumstance that immigration is all over the place right now. It is largely whenever you see a party shift from one party to another, immigration is almost always at the forefront. I will say it's more polarized today than it ever has been. The Refugee Act of 1980 that was passed was fully bipartisan. It was not just co-sponsored across the aisle, but received resounding support from both parties. And so it's more politicized, but it has often been throughout the United States history really central to a lot of policy. Holy moly, this is a lot of words on the screen. And I think it also speaks to how complicated immigration policy is, and by design, right? It doesn't fall within the Justice Department. When someone is wrapped up in immigration court, that is separate from our typical Justice Department. It's not criminal, it's not civil, it's its own kind of world. And when we talk about immigrant groups, we often conflate terms. And so I wanted to just spend a second pulling apart all of these different immigrant groups that we might have in the United States. And so if there's 49 million immigrants in the United States, the vast majority are citizens. They have come to the United States, they have adjusted status, and they are now a full legal member of the United States. And it is quite difficult to distinguish anything different between me, who immigrated to the United States, and someone who was born in the US, my husband. Our rights are very, very similar. I can't run for president. but I will be okay with that. What I started with was a whole bunch of different visas, but green card holder is another significant chunk of our immigration kind of pie, and I'll show you the pie on the next graph. But green card holders have now been legally authorized to live permanently in the United States. They have a pathway to citizenship, but they're not yet US citizens. There's still some hurdles, and as you all know from all of your voter drives, I feel like a pretty good handle on green card holders and citizens. Where things start to get murky is all of the other statuses. So refugee and asylee status is both codified internationally through international rights law, as well as in the United States. They adopted the same definition. In the United States, codified under law, a refugee is someone who flees their home country due to fear of persecution, and it has to be based off of essentially our protected classes, but race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership to a particular social group. You'll notice poor economic conditions are not in there. Fleeing natural disaster or environmental safety is not in there. This is individuals that are persecuted based off of who they are or what they believe. And so they are granted protections before entering the United States if you're a refugee, or if you come to the port of entry of the United States or you're already in the United States, you then claim asylum. And so they have the same basis of why they are coming to the United States, but if they are granted status before entering the US, they're a refugee, and if they seek that protection at a port of entry or in the United States, they're an asylee. So it's the same kind of background. And then we have DACA recipients. That's the deferred action group of folks. And these are individuals that were children that were brought into the United States as children, and may or may not know their documentation status. But as a blanket, they were given the ability to apply for this deferred action. And the deferred action essentially means that there is no permanent pathway to citizenship or residency. It is a temporary status that has to be renewed. Individuals are no longer able to continue renewing that. That's been removed as a protection, but it is temporary in nature. Similarly, a non-tourist visa, those are largely students, so people on student visa or seasonal worker visas. So there's an agricultural temporary visa. There's different work authorizations. H-1B is one that we're hearing a lot in the news right now because it's actually how my family came here. But there are H-1Bs are non-tourist visas that allow individuals to work here temporarily. There, again, is no pathway to citizenship through that. It is temporary in nature. And then we have asylum applicants. And so because the US immigration system is so large and they're handling all of these different kind of visa and removal and all of these different things, I can apply for asylum, but they're not able to rule on my ability to apply for asylum right away. And so you can be an asylum seeker or an asylum applicant, and that means that you have been found to have likely a fear of persecution, but we can't yet make a ruling on the documentation. So we've done an interview with you, and what you have said to us speaks to the basis of an asylum application, but you have no records of proof yet. We haven't reviewed any of that. So we're going to give you a temporary allowance to be in the United States while we review all of your asylum information. And then we can either approve asylum or deny asylum, which would then provide you with no immigration status. And that's where we find ourselves, oftentimes with unauthorized individuals. And so that's the last kind of group here. That's individuals that live in the United States but don't have any authorization to be here. There's no visa. Either because they entered without inspection between border points or they've overstayed a visa. That was a lot. And I'm just looking at the chat. I don't see any questions yet. I'm going to go to the next screen where you can see the pie chart of all of these different groups, and pause to see if anyone has any kind of questions on who we're talking about while we kind of talk through this. It's worth noting there's an asterisk between refugees and asylees. 3.6 million refugees and asylees have been brought to the United States or approved for asylum since 1975, but the vast majority of them have likely now moved to a different status. So they are either a green card holder or a citizen. So they largely actually fall within the other categories. DACA is a very small group compared to all of the other kind of areas. And so I think if you randomly ask someone, how many people do you think here are here with DACA status? I think people would be surprised to know that it's an incredibly small number compared to all of the other groups. And then I've noted here, asylum applicants, you can claim asylum at any time. And so about half of the asylum applicants came to the US border and as a request of a visa, asked for affirmative asylum, said, I'm coming, I'm claiming asylum. That's what my case is pending on. And about half were in some other visa category, or they were unauthorized in the United States and were undetected. And then when they became detected, they then claimed asylum as a defensive mechanism to avoid deportation back to a country where they might have fled persecution.
So we have a question in the chat. Melanie asked, how have the numbers changed in the past 10 years?
That's a great question. I think I got it right there. We'll talk about refugees specifically. But in the last 10 years, we've continued to see an increase of immigrant populations coming to the United States. I'll note that in January 2025, we had peaked at the number of folks as a percentage of the total US population in January of last year. That goes back historically to essentially when we started tracking immigrant groups as a percentage of the United States population. And so there were certainly a couple of significant lulls of immigrant populations in the United States. But recent trends have larger groups of immigrants arriving in the last 10 years.
We have another question in the chat. Cheryl asked, what are some reasons for a green card holder to lose that status? Famous people like Paul McCartney are green card holders with no aim to become a citizen. Any idea how many green card holders want to stay that way?
That's a fantastic question. So a green card is a permanent status that is renewable without any additional requirements to continue renewing. And I've got to keep myself honest. There's two different groups of green cards. One that's renewed every 5 years, one that's renewed every 10 years. After 5 years, you are able to adjust status. And so I will tell you candidly, in my family, we have had green card status for 15 years. and not everyone in my family has become a US citizen. And I think a lot of the reason is logistics. It's expensive. It's an expensive process. It is a long process. And in the swearing-in ceremony that I'm sure many of you have sat through, you renounce your citizenship of any other nation. And so it's deeply personal. And so I think there are certainly a large group of folks that want to have the permanent right to come to the United States and work here without ever wanting to become a permanent US citizen. In the same way, there's many countries in the world that I would love to be able to go and work and live in, but I don't necessarily want to be a long-term citizen and renounce my US or previously Canadian citizenship. And yes, green card holders pay taxes. We'll talk in depth about the rights and responsibilities of all of these different immigrant groups. But I'm going to zero in on refugees and asylum seekers because that's the work that we do. So JVS, Jewish Vocational Services, specifically works with vulnerable immigrant group. There's a large number of immigrants that come to the United States that are not vulnerable, my family included. We had a really privileged immigration experience. And it's why I do the work, is because I know that I had a really privileged experience moving to the United States. It was expensive, but fairly simplistic. And most people don't have that experience, certainly most vulnerable groups. And so we work specifically with refugees and asylum seekers, as well as unaccompanied minors that fall within that refugee and asylum seeker group. Those are individuals, again, that have fled their country because of violence and a personal, well-founded fear of persecution. So it can't be blanket across the country. It has to be demonstrated as a personal fear specific to oneself. So that's who we work with. And just to put kind of some understanding around it, today in the world, there are more refugees and stateless people than there ever have been in world history. There's 130 million forcibly displaced or stateless people. And then when you start kind of narrowing down what that means, under the definition of well-founded fear of persecution, there's 35.3 million refugees that fall into that bucket. So of the 130 million, a lot of people are forcibly displaced due to natural disasters, due to economic barriers, but wouldn't fall under the definition of refugee. Almost half, or over half actually, of the world's population of refugees are children. And it's worth flagging that a significant number of folks are born as refugees and often in stateless status. So they're born in a country that would not recognize them as a citizen in that country because they don't have birthright citizenship. And the country that their family might have fled from wouldn't recognize them as a citizen either because they're not in that country. And so in the US, of those 35 million people that are certified as refugees, the US has resettled a little over 11,000 in 2001, 25,000 in 2022, over 60,000 in 2023. In FY 2024, it was 100,000. And then this year we'll be on track to resettle somewhere probably in the 20,000 person range. But I think it's worth flagging that the experience of these people, they often spend a very significant time in refugee camps or in urban settings waiting for a third-party solution, a third country solution, a place where they can sit down and put their things down and say, okay, this is my home. That's usually about a 17-year process. Sometimes when we talk about these numbers, they just seem so big that they don't have any meaning. As a Canadian, I like to think of my entire country. If every single person in the country was a refugee, that's what we're talking about, the scale. Everyone, more than the population of Australia, there are folks that have nowhere to call home. And so the experience is, often we think of this as like the 3 traumatic experiences. You've got the experience of leaving your home, where you fear persecution and have a fear for your life or your family's life. And then you have a journey to somewhere. So if you fled conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, you migrate to what was once the largest refugee camp in the world. It is no longer, but Kakuma camp. And you might live there for 17 years. And by the very nature of a refugee camp, they are not permanent structures. So you're typically talking tents or movable structures. They're by design not permanent. Although you could live there from the day you were born until you become an adult. And then you have the experience of resettlement to the United States. And that in and of itself can be really, really traumatic, and pretty jarring. The number of folks that in their first couple of months of being resettled that say, can I go back to Tanzania, is very common, because it's a really jarring experience to be in a tent for 17 years and have your whole world inside the camp, to come to the United States and say, okay, what's your plan for work? And your kids are going to go off to school now on a bus, and you'll see them when they get home, and you don't speak the language. It can be quite traumatic. And I think it's worth flagging, asylum seekers have a very similar pathway, right? They have been forced to leave their home, and oftentimes their journey is to the southern border, right? Because they can leave their home and traverse by land and claim asylum at the US border. The difference is that they often then have a long legal process to establish that asylum status. I think the number one question I got during the Trump's first administration is like, well, yeah, but how do we know who we're bringing in? How do we know these folks? And I think it's just worth flagging that of all of the different ways that you can come to the United States, whether it be a visitor visa, an H-1B, a green card, spousal marriage, the single most vetted group of people to come to the United States are individuals that go through the refugee resettlement process. The 17 years in a camp is because there's so few places that resettle refugees, but it's also because the process to be placed in the United States is a very arduous process. So there's registration into international and domestic agencies' databases with iris scans, biodata, fingerprints, facial scans. There's health screenings. There is an orientation about kind of rule of law in the United States. There's security checks from the FBI, State Department, Department of War, Counterterrorism Center, fraud detection, through embassies. And then there are 3 different interviews that individuals go through over kind of an 18 to 3-year process, 18-month to 3-year process, to confirm consistencies in stories, to make sure that nobody is saying one thing and then 6 months later the story is different, and then 6 months later the story is different again. And so by far the most vetted individuals to come in the United States come through the refugee resettlement pathway. So I have a question for you all that I would love to hear. Any ideas of like, why would the United States agree to be a part of the refugee resettlement process? And knowing that there are 35 million refugees around the world, and we resettled last year was like a banner year of 100,000. Why would the United States engage in refugee resettlement? You can put it in the chat. To acquire talent and work setting, yeah. Oh, Laura, thanks for your question. While other people are putting in things, the less than 2% of the world's refugees bullets means that of the 35 million refugees in the United States, less than 2% will ever get placed in a permanent third country home. And so they will.
So you mean that the other 98% stay in refugee camps?
Yep. Or they become stateless because they're in an urban setting. So they have refugee status in Istanbul, and they will not have Turkish citizenship. They won't be able to return home, and they'll never be placed in a country that will recognize them.
And is there a number to that 98%?
Yes. I'm gonna very quickly just do the
I mean, just a rough number, just to give us the full impact of how many people are, in a sense, then permanent refugees. Is that what you're saying?
exactly. It's about
Okay.
33 million.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's worldwide, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And the US resettles like less than 1%.
Right. Wow. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah, because so many of our families are refugees. I think that that's really lovely, Joyce. There's a really interesting statistic. 40% of the US population family came through Ellis Island, which I think is just one of those like remarkable numbers. There's also, when we talk about like the southern border processing and how many folks are coming in per day. So like Ellis Island processed something like 11,000 people in one day. So like the history of the United States is so ingrained with immigration. Yep. Humanitarian, the Statue of Liberty's invitation, exactly. We owe it to our Afghan helpers, and we respond to a natural disaster. Yeah, Donna, that's a really great point. We, yeah, to help with diversity brings new ways to problem solve and innovate. Totally. I think we typically think of three major reasons. The first is, I always start with the economic. We know that for every dollar the US spends on refugee resettlement, yep, there we go. German, yeah, Swedish came through Boston. Yeah, that was a major entry point, I think, back in the 10s. But economic. So for every dollar the US government spends on refugee resettlement or the benefits, public benefits that refugees and immigrants would be eligible for, they receive 4 times that amount in tax base. So not just like economic spending power, they overpay in taxes to cover the expense that the government has expended by 4 times. Incredibly huge economic indicators. In Kansas City, $1.3 million a year is paid by immigrant taxes, which is just a huge number. And then it's over $1 billion in economic activity per year by refugees and immigrants in Kansas City alone. So huge driver economically. The second is, I like to believe, a humanitarian view of it. But it largely has to do with American exceptionalism. We can look around the world and say, look what we're doing, you need to do it too. And it's very nice to be able to say that to countries that live very close to conflict areas, right? So during the Syrian conflict, when I lived in Syria, there was over 1 million refugees from Syria right along the Turkish border, in Turkey. And the Turkish-Syrian dynamic is very complex and not friendly, but it helps a lot for the US to be able to say, we accept refugees, everyone else around the world has to as well. And that kind of leads into the third one, is that there is substantial foreign affairs that bank on the fact that there is refugee resettlement and humanitarian missions around the world. And so, for instance, everyone, I think, in the world has a cell phone that has a lithium-ion battery in it. Maybe not everyone, but a lot of us. And that lithium-ion battery has in it cobalt, and all of the world's cobalt, it's like 98% of the world's cobalt, all comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which happens to be the country where we resettle across the nation and here in Kansas City the most people from. And part of that is because of drilling rights and the armed conflict that happened over the drilling rights for cobalt, and the mining rights. And so part of our foreign affairs activity in embassies and consulates around the world is a trade between what we can provide in terms of resettlement when people are displaced because of conflicts that we fund, for rights in these countries to exchange goods that matter. And so the stability of the Democratic Republic of Congo is really important to our domestic interests. And refugee resettlement is tied into that, right? We can say, as a country, we understand that some of our policies displace folks, or that it is in our best interest as a nation to have our partners in NATO share the burden of individuals that are displaced to their countries. And that is an important aspect to our foreign policy. Any questions? Whoop, 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 whoop. Oh, I just skipped so many things. There we go. Any other questions there? So let me show you a little bit about US resettlement. We typically think of modern refugee resettlement as from 1980 on. And that's largely because that's when the Refugee Act was codified, the bipartisan bill. Ted Kennedy was like the father of ensuring that there was a comprehensive immigration policy. And to his point, part of the reason that there was a need for a comprehensive Refugee Resettlement Act is because from like 1880, I want to say, to 1980, there were 16 different laws that were passed to deal with specific population groups. So after the Vietnam War, there was a specific rule that allowed Amerasians and the children of US soldiers into the United States with permanent status. After the Holocaust, there was a specific vulnerable populations quota that allowed people from that were displaced by World War II specifically to come to the United States. They were all these kind of one-offs. And then around the end of the 70s, at the end of the Vietnam War, when there was a large displacement of people from Vietnam, as well as the Cuban embassy crisis, they had kind of these two big issues with two very different populations fleeing at the exact same time. And what they realized is, let's stop doing these onesie twosie off things, and let's pass a comprehensive immigration bill dealing with specifically with refugees. And so they did. And there's it's huge. It's like thousands of pages long. And it very clearly lays out how refugee resettlement should happen in the United States, including that screening process, including a determination that the president makes every year of how many refugees to let in based off of world circumstances. And so the highest it was ever set was right when the act was enacted. And that was largely because of a large number of Cuban entrants and a large number of individuals with Vietnam and the Soviet Union. And so you'll see every year the president is meant, under the Refugee Resettlement Act, they are meant to consult with Congress to say what is going on in the world, what is our foreign policy strategy, and because of that, what is our refugee resettlement ceiling? And they set that. And so that's the blue number. And you'll see it really fluctuates. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. It really very much mirrors what's going on in the world. So in 1995, they allowed a large number of Soviet refugees in, and then additionally a large number of folks from Kosovo. In 2008, there was a massive Burmese refugee population in the world. The largest refugee camp now in the world is largely Burmese and folks that fled in 2008, and then in 2015 we had the large scale Syrian displacement. So you can see, like, those are the spikes based off of what we needed geopolitically in the world. And then the orange is the number of folks that we actually let in. And so that obviously also has to do with US policy and domestic indicators. So in 2001, after 9/11, there was a substantial pause to refugee resettlement to ensure that vetting processes were appropriate and so on and so forth. And then it started building back up. The previous Trump administration halted refugee resettlement down to the 20,000 kind of mark. And of course we had COVID as well. And so there was a substantial pause to refugee resettlement there. And then under the previous administration, under the Biden administration, there was a desire to restart up refugee resettlement in a really profound way. And then in January of this year, all refugee resettlement was fully paused again. So we are currently waiting on a presidential determination for this next fiscal year, which started October 1st. Obviously, with the government shutdown, nothing has started. The presidential determination is meant to have already occurred before the start of the fiscal year. And to our knowledge, the number is going to be significantly, it appears it's going to be 7,500, which would be the lowest ceiling in refugee resettlement history in the United States. When people come, I think it's always worth thinking about, like, okay, if someone's been living in a refugee camp for 17 years and then they come to the United States, what is going to be important to ensure they come to the United States and they have the tools that they need to succeed, right? And so I'd love to hear in the chat, or if anyone's got any questions too, I'm happy to pause here. Some of the things that you think jump out as the most critical. How many other countries have birthright citizen? Carol, that's a great question. I don't have that answer. I will get back to you. I think it's substantial. I think there are fewer countries that don't give birthright citizenship than do. But let me fact check myself, and I'll get back to you on that. Housing, Margaret. Couldn't be right. Yeah, case managers, support funds. Definitely. ESL, Joyce, couldn't agree more. Housing, transportation, how to manage money. Yeah, definitely. And that's how we see our work breakdown. We typically see it as housing and transportation and how to manage money. That kind of first community integration, that's a big bucket of our work. Yep, and then employment possibilities, that's the second kind of big bucket. So we'll pick someone up from the airport, bring them to a fully furnished home with groceries, and do a housing orientation. We will work with clients to come up with their individual employment plans, how to build a resume, interview skills, enrollment in education, including ESL programming or recertifying if they had any overseas education, getting that recertified and validated for work here in the United States. And then there's, of course, that kind of health and wellness piece too. So we have on-staff therapists, and provide kind of intensive case management for any kind of specialized needs. And so that's a big piece to the work that we do. I'm gonna go through this kind of quickly. We do the things that you think are needed are done. And it's fairly robust. We've got a staff of about 60 folks. And so this kind of gives you the trajectory. So in 2001, we resettled 109. Last fiscal year, we resettled 627. So like really substantial jump. And then before January, we resettled 350 individuals. And then as I mentioned, on Inauguration Day, all refugee resettlement was paused. And so we haven't resettled anyone since. And we don't expect to resettle folks in the near future. So in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to cover some things that have changed with the new administration. This, I think, speaks to, this is like my favorite graph. This is all of the different statuses we talked to along the top and what benefits they might be eligible for. Everything that's got like a little gray box around it recently changed with HR 1. And so, for instance, refugees and asylees used to be eligible for SNAP benefits or Medicaid, and they are no longer eligible for those. Some of them are going to take a year to have impact, but SNAP benefits, anyone that is on SNAP right now, if you're a refugee, you no longer have the ability. All worth noting that except for going to school, if you are unauthorized in the United States, you were never eligible for any public benefits. If you're an asylum applicant, not really eligible either. Most non-tourist visas, not eligible, and DACA recipients, largely ineligible. But the biggest change that we have seen is individuals are likely to very quickly lose their SNAP and healthcare benefits. And then I think it's also worth knowing that what are their rights, right? What things are they able to do? So in the good old capitalist system, everyone's able to pay taxes. Don't worry. And in fact, 32 million tax returns last year that were submitted were people that did individual tax identifying numbers. And so those are individuals that don't have Social Security cards. They can't get Social Security card. They can't get benefits, but they're still paying taxes. And so it's something like, I can't remember the number, but it's billions and billions of dollars are individuals that pay taxes that can't qualify for any benefits. And then, as you all know, only citizens have the right to vote in federal elections. There is some wonkiness about eligibility to work. So for instance, if I apply for asylum and my case is taken more than 150 days, I can then get work authorization. Yeah. Any questions on this? We also often hear that like refugees and immigrants are big drains on our public assistance. It is interesting that those with green cards can fight for this country but cannot vote. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. So non-citizens, just in terms of people that access these programs, less than 7% of recipients of any of these public benefits are non-citizens. Like of Medicare, it's like an incredibly small percentage. SSI, incredibly small percentage of overall benefits. And so let me talk a little bit about the impact this has had for folks here in Kansas City. There's 3 major impacts that we're seeing. The first is family separation. So this is a client of ours who, because of how the immigration pathway works, his family fled the Democratic Republic of Congo, I want to say like 20 some odd years ago, and were actually some of the first folks to arrive in the refugee camp in Tanzania. And he was born in the refugee camp in Tanzania, and he was part of his family's case until he turned 18. And then at 18, he splits off into his own case. And so by happenstance, his case actually got processed faster. And he was able to come to the United States in December of 2022, but his rest of his family remained in Tanzania. We received his family's travel information, called him, let him know, great news, your family is going to come. They're arriving the first week of February. We'll meet them at the airport. Do you want to make the meal for them, or do you want us to provide the hot meal for them? So on and so forth. And will you be living with them, or are you going to stay living on your own? I'll stay in my apartment for now until the lease is up, and then I'll move in with them. All of these plans are made. On January 20th, January 24th, all refugee resettlement ended. We had to make a phone call to him and say, I'm so sorry. In fact, your family's travel was canceled. And he said, no problem. Will you let me know when it's rebooked? And we said, no, unfortunately, it won't be rebooked. We don't know when in the future they might. And so there's it was a really, really tough conversation. And he will say, he said, I'm in college, and college students need their parents. Like, they need to be able to talk to their parents and get help and things like that. And so that was really, really kind of devastating. And we see tons of those cases. We literally have hundreds of these cases where families have been separated. The second is loss of employment authorization. And so we have a client that was an interpreter for the US Army in Afghanistan. He was one of the first folks that was evacuated and placed with JVS. He actually served as an interpreter for JVS for a very long time. He was given a special immigrant visa, which certified that he was part of the US military. His supervisor in the military wrote a letter and was given that visa. But because of the way that those visas are issued, he was not also given his green card at the same time. If he had done it all overseas before coming to the United States, he would have been given his green card overseas, but he wasn't. And so his application is still pending. Because of a lag in processing applications, he still doesn't have a green card, and his work authorization was canceled as a part of the rescinding of temporary protected status for Afghans. So he's unable to work. He has his own, he's lived here now for 5 years almost, 4 years. And he has never met his unborn son. His family is still in Afghanistan, and now he is grappling with what he's supposed to do. So he has the right to be in the United States, but he has no proof that he's able to work, and so he's not able to work. And then finally, the benefits navigation. So we have this really lovely family. They are just one of the most lovely people. dad is working in a warehouse making $15 an hour. But because of the size of their family, and mom is trying to learn ESL classes, they still receive a small SNAP benefit that is small, but it's important for their family. Because of HR 1, the One Big Beautiful Bill, they now are no longer eligible for those SNAP benefits. So as a family, they're going to lose $400 a month in SNAP benefits. And the family is really grappling with what they're going to do now. They've got a 3-year-old at home, and mom is the primary caretaker for that 3-year-old. Comes to ESL classes with the 3-year-old quite often. And so she's trying to figure out, do we enroll them in pre-K, and can I find a job that can make up for the SNAP benefits, but will be flexible enough with my schedule so that I'm able to pick up and drop off my kid. I'll kind of leave it here. There's this really lovely quote. I'm grateful I worked at IRC, which was founded by this poet and Albert Einstein together. And I'm proud to work at JBS too, that also highlights a lot of this work. And I think it's that, like, our job, it could so easily fall into despair. But meeting with families that are losing their SNAP benefits can be really, really challenging. And I think that we all have the opportunity to kind of bring hope in these situations. So it's a challenging time, but we are constantly talking about pathways of success with our clients, so that yeah, we can feel hopeful in these times. I think that's all I got. Here's ways you can engage with JBS. We got a volunteer info session next Saturday. And I'm gonna put a QR code on the screen so you can go right to the page that will give you all the information of all the work that we do. So I just spoke a ton. I would love any burning questions. I'm gonna do my Googling really quick about birthright citizenship, but any other questions? I love the game Stump the Chump. I'll take all of the hard questions, or any of the softball ones too.
I'd like to know how expensive and how long the process it is for people that are here. By the time they pay attorney's fees, and work their way through the system to become, like, to go to these naturalization ceremonies, that's not cheap. That is expensive.
Yeah, it's very expensive, and as with attorney fees, sometimes you get what your money pays for. So there's like big scams with what are called notaros, which are like kind of like notaries, but they can't actually practice law, but they'll pretend like they can. And so so you can do it on the cheap for under $1,000, and 5 years of waiting and classes and taking time off work and all of those things for one individual. And then depending on there are some waivers, right? Like if you receive SNAP benefits, or you had an income level that was below the poverty line, you can sometimes get waivers for some of the fees, but those waivers have now gone away. And unfortunately, it's currently being held up in the courts, but they've introduced a whole bunch of new fees for visas. So if you have a pending asylum application, you have to pay an extra $1,000 or $500 every year to keep in pending asylum status, which to me is really heartbreaking, because it's not these folks' fault that these processes are drawn out and taking really long times to get through. And so It's kind of like if I went to the DMV and was like, hey, I need a new driver's license, mine's about to expire. And they say, okay, we'll pay us $1,000 every year that it takes us to be able to create you a new driver's license. It's like, well, what if you just gave me my driver's license? So anyways, go ahead, Donna.
What about, is it actually in effect that you can pay $1 million and get is it a visa or something? The golden
Golden
card?
visa. Yeah, those actually, they exist around the world, right? Like they're kind of called like investor visas or like golden visas. So yeah, I mean, much like many systems in the world, these issues of new fees and immigration policy and things getting slowed down really don't affect people that have significant wealth or resources at their disposal. So yes, in the United States and in many other countries, Ireland's got it, Canada's got it, the UK has it, an idea of like a golden visa where if you invest $1 million in the United States, you can have a visa to be here. And then there's pathways to green card and citizenship.
I have one more question. I was thinking on your chart that people weren't eligible for Medicare in the different categories, yet you had another chart that showed a very small percentage of people that got Medicare.
Yeah.
How can you explain that?
For sure, yeah. So of the current folks that are non-citizens, so green card holders are eligible, as were refugees, were eligible. And so those folks are eligible, and of everyone that takes advantage of these benefits systems, a very small number of them are non-citizens. So let's see. That was the chart, and here's where you can see everyone that's a green card holder is eligible, for instance. Refugees and asylees previously were eligible. And so that percentage certainly will drop down below the 3 to 6% that it's currently at in the next year.
And that no is due to the big, beautiful bill.
That's right. Yep. The big, beautiful bill that passed removed eligibility. Alice, great question. We've got to be, Alice asked in the chat, is JBS doing any work to package these human told stories for the purpose of educating people and chip away at the often repeated narrative that all immigrants are bad? I hold the personal belief that there is no right way to make sure your family can live. And so we're very careful to say, like, I can't make the decision of who is a good immigrant and who's a bad immigrant, or what the right way is, because claiming asylum is a legal international right, and it's a right in the United States too. And so a lot of these folks that are unauthorized are also claiming asylum status. So it's tricky to say, like, who's a good immigrant and who's a bad immigrant, who's a good person, who's a bad person. I don't know. It's all tricky. But we are trying to share these stories. We're also really trying to balance. It's a scary time to put your name out there. And so even when the National Guard was being called up, we had a really serious conversation. Do we put out a statement, or do we, sign on to other people's statements? Because do we necessarily want to direct attention to individuals or our agency as a whole, when I think it's just humanitarian work at its core?
Okay, let's go ahead and take a couple more questions, but then I'm gonna move on to something. But those that maybe have questions can maybe hold on after I allow some reports that need to be made. Joan, do you have that time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right, so it looks like Carol has a question.
Oh, Carol, you're muted.
Thank you. We're seeing some pretty horrific things of people showing up to court and to pursue their court cases and being arrested and harassed. What do those people do? Who is there to help them? Are they just being shipped straight to Venezuela? What's going on?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's a constantly evolving situation. And so you'll see it being held up in the courts a lot, like deportations. There's restraining orders on deportations for certain groups and things like that. What is happening, the logistics of it, is that people are showing up to court for a defensive asylum case. And you can't deport someone while they have an active case. And so the US government might have brought a charge against them for being in the United States for being unauthorized. They're being summoned to court for those charges. And so they're showing up for those charges. And then the government is saying they're dismissing the charges with them in the room, which sounds like good news, right? Like, oh, I don't have this immigration proceeding against me anymore, except it now makes them eligible for immediate deportation. And so they have suspended granting parole. So if you are detained by Homeland Security or ICE, they're no longer releasing people on parole, which is a change this year as well. So unfortunately, they're remaining detained until such time your family or legal representation is able to prove that you have authorized status in the United States. And so in some cases that happens and it takes months and people have been detained for a very long time. Sometimes it happens really quickly and they're released. And then in most cases, individuals are deported pretty swiftly.
Okay, any other questions? Joan, can you stop? I love the screenshot that you've got up there, but can you stop just for a minute?
Yes.
Sharing the screen. Thank you. And then I was trying to go to gallery view, but okay. I'm trying to get my view back here. There we go. Joan, I appreciate you talking. We'll come back in a minute to see if some of you have any other questions. But because we were kind of getting to the time frame, I didn't know if anybody had any committee reports that they needed to share quickly before we ended the meeting. So I'm not seeing any hands raised. Okay. Well, with that said, then does anybody have any final questions for Joan? And if some of you need to leave because of the timing, I appreciate you being here. And before you do leave, I think we've all learned quite a bit of information today. There's a lot of stuff going on to our fellow humans, and it's heartbreaking. So Joan, I think I can speak for all of us that we certainly appreciate the work that you and Jewish Vocational Services are doing to help these people. I mean, thank you so much for telling us about the different information and giving us some of those statistics. Does anybody have any final questions that they would like Joan to address while she's with us today?
I see Cheryl's question in the chat here. I read some people, like actor Craig Ferguson, kept their original citizenship for him, his Scottish one, when becoming U.S. citizenship. How many new citizens have dual or triple citizenship? I don't have that answered. That's a great question. I will say that largely refugees are not able to return to their country of origin. And so the way that citizenship renunciation happens is like in the eyes of the US government, I am just a US citizen. The Canadians are like, that's cute. You're also still a Canadian. So don't forget about paying taxes and all of those things. And so I have dual citizenship, even though the United States recognizes me as having American citizenship only. And the Canadians say, yeah, you're still ours too. So it depends on the country. Some countries don't allow it. So if you take on US citizenship, you in effect have renounced your citizenship. And then I did a quick Google. It looks like, of course, they say, I don't know. Thanks, ChatGPT at Google. But this says approximately 35 have unconditional birthright citizenship, meaning any child born within their borders are automatically given citizenship. These countries include the United States, Canada, UK, Germany, New Zealand, blah, 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 blah. So.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or comments today? Okay, well, Joan, again, thank you so much for coming and giving us this information. I find it very powerful. The slides very powerful, and the information that you provided. And if the people want to help, they can come to Jewish Vocational Services website and find more information. So on behalf of the League of Women Voters Kansas City, again, thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Does anybody else have anything they need to bring before those of us here today? All right. I think with that said, that we'll go ahead and conclude the Zoom meeting for today. Enjoy the rest of your weekend and keep going out there and doing what needs to be done. So thank you. All right. Thanks, Joan.